Hey everyone, and welcome to the video for section 5 of chapter 29 as we move from World War to Cold War. So the Allies were celebrating a hard-fought victory, but the reality of the war's devastation quickly dampened those positive feelings. Let's take a look at the war's aftermath. First, some numbers. All right, so these are the estimated, and that's kind of a key thing. We'll never know the exact numbers, but the estimated casualties of World War II. All right, the Allies first, the military dead. You can see how Britain, France, each over, and the United States, each over 200,000. All right, a lot of military wounded. The U.S. had, interestingly enough, a lot more wounded than the other ones. Civilian dead. All right, France had the most of the civilian dead. Makes sense, okay? They were invaded. Most of the 93,000 that were killed as civilians, that was during the bombing runs, the Blitz. America only had 6,000 civilian dead because there wasn't much fighting. Actually, there wasn't any fighting in what was truly considered American soil. This would have come through Pearl Harbor or maybe some civilians that were serving overseas. You look at the Soviet Union, though, in particular, 7.5 million military dead, 14 million military wounded, and 15 million civilian dead. All right, these casualty numbers of the Soviet Union were out of the park. All right, they were way more than the other ones. A lot of fighting took place in the Soviet Union. Long-term sieges, like you saw at Leningrad and Stalingrad, led to a lot of civilian deaths. So the Soviet Union had a lot of rebuilding to do after the war. Germany as well. All right, 3.5 million dead, 5 million military wounded, 780,000 civilian deaths. Japan, a lot of military deaths and wounded, 672 civilian deaths, and a big chunk of them came from bombing raids, including the two atomic bombs that happened towards the end of the war. All right, so let's get into a little bit about the kind of the details here. The losses of the war were tremendous, like we just looked at, but the brutality of the Axis, especially Germany, also needed to be addressed. The full extent of the Holocaust became known as the Allies liberated the concentration camps. The Allies had known that the camps existed, but they didn't know the scale of the death in them until after the war ended. All total, some 6 million Jews were killed, and millions more were displaced and couldn't go home. You look at the statistics by country. Look at Poland in particular, all right? Their Jewish population before the war and after. The Jewish populations of these countries were decimated, and they were really never going to go back to the way they were. Now, mostly because of the Holocaust, many surviving Nazi leaders were put on trial for war crimes or crimes against humanity. That's a new term that kind of came about at this time. This was the first time in history that military or government officials were put on trial for actions taken during a war. These war crime trials took place in Nuremberg, Germany, where Hitler had staged mass rallies against Jews in the 1930s. Nearly 200 Germans were tried and found guilty. A handful of top Nazis received death sentences, others were imprisoned. Similar trials like this took place in Japan. Here you see General Tojo on trial. This was in the Philippines. Now, while trials like these can never bring full justice against those who perpetrated horrible actions in wartime, it showed for the first time ever that leaders can be held accountable for actions in wartime. A major step in ensuring peace in the future was the creation of an international peacekeeping organization, the United Nations, or the UN. Here you see the UN building that's on the East River in New York City. Now, this wasn't the first time the world tried to create an international peacekeeping organization. After World War I, the League of Nations was created, and that was a colossal failure. So, delegates from 50 nations met to make something that would improve upon the League's failures. First and foremost, the UN could actually enforce decisions. It had the power to do so. Action could be taken by UN members. Each member nation was a part of what we call the General Assembly. So the General Assembly is the meeting of everybody. And they were each given one vote on major decisions or actions. A much smaller group, the Security Council, was given more significant power. It consisted of 15 member nations. You have 10 rotating nations and 5 permanent nations. The permanent members are what you see here. You have the United States, you have Great Britain, all right, so U.S., Great Britain, France, China, and this is the Russian flag, although back then when it was formed, it was the Soviet Union. Permanent council members have a lot more say than basically anybody else in the UN. They can veto any council decisions, meaning shoot it down. And it has the power to apply either economic or military sanctions, such as blockading trade to a country or sending peacekeeping military force like you see in the picture here. The UN's role goes beyond military peacekeeping, though. The organization is responsible for addressing problems throughout the world, such as outbreak of disease or food shortages in areas experiencing famine or drought. You see some organizations that attend to this. You've got the World Health Organization. You've got the Agricultural Organization as well, okay? They handle more humanitarian efforts as opposed to just going in there and solve military crisis or block economic aid or something like that. Now, a problem that the UN has run into is that its members don't always get along. Now, some of these conflicts started immediately after the war ended, and so we'll look at how these alliances broke apart. Even before the war ended, differences between the Allies grew. We already discussed in previous sections how Western democracies, like the United States, here you see President Truman, and Great Britain, here you see Winston Churchill, they did not trust this guy, Premier Stalin. They didn't like the idea of being allies with him, but Hitler was considered to be the greater threat. Well, now that the war is over, the distrust and conflicting ideologies are going to come to the forefront. They're not just going to magically be friends. And this is going to make working together very, very difficult. This led to what we call the Cold War. Now, we're going to go into the Cold War in a lot more detail in the next chapter, but for now, just know that it was a time of tension and hostility between the nations aligned with the U.S. and nations aligned with the Soviet Union, right? So Team U.S. versus Team Soviet Union. What really started the Cold War was the Soviet domination of Eastern Europe after World War II. After the Battle of Stalingrad, the German army was driven out of the Soviet Union. The Soviet, or Red Army, chased the Germans through Eastern Europe into Germany itself. After the war ended, though, the Soviet army didn't leave these areas. Stalin ordered them to stay and establish communist governments in nations like Poland, Czechoslovakia, Hungary, Romania, Bulgaria, all right, all of these that were still part of the Soviet Union. And we'll notice how a section of Germany is shaded in here as well. We'll talk more about that in a minute. Now, this rapid spread of communist control led to a struggle to contain communism. The struggle was exemplified by the Truman Doctrine. Put forth by President Truman in March of 1947, it was rooted in the idea of containment. Rather than actively try to destroy communism, it was meant to limit communism to areas that were already under Soviet control. So let's look at the map again. They figured, all right, if this is going to be the border of Soviet control, we can't let any more get over here and start spreading all over the place. Now, this would be accomplished through lending military and economic aid to nations that wanted to withstand communism, such as you see here in this headline. Truman has $400 million to aid in Greece and Turkey. You see, here's Greece. There's Turkey, right on the border with all these communist countries. They were worried about the Soviet coming in. So Truman says, let's give them millions and millions of dollars to try and prevent them. Now, a significant example of this was the Marshall Plan. The Marshall Plan was meant to strengthen Western European nations that were devastated by the war, namely Germany and France. The U.S. would give food, economic assistance, supplies, whatever it needed to Europe to help them rebuild. Here you see the amount that it was given. The higher the blue, the more that was given. So you see France, West Germany, Italy, Great Britain in particular, they were given a lot of support because of the Marshall Plan. The U.S. did offer similar aid to Eastern European nations, but Stalin wouldn't let it through. Now, despite these efforts, Germany remained divided. After the war, Germany was divided into 4 zones among the Allies. All right, so the red here you have for the Soviet Union, you've got green for Great Britain, blue for France, and kind of this yellowish-orange one for the United States. The Soviet Union wanted to take reparations for its war losses by moving factories from within its territory into now Eastern Germany, and kind of use the natural resources there as well. The Western leaders, though, they eventually turned control of their zones back to an independent German government. The Soviet Union refused to leave. They said, nope, we're taking from this what we can because of our losses in the war. And so because of this, East Germany stayed communist. The Soviet Union installed a puppet communist government similar to the nations of Eastern Europe that we just discussed. This led to a pretty significant crisis in the city of Berlin. All right, in an event known as the Berlin Airlift, right? So here you see that there's this weird little multicolored spot in here. That's Berlin. All right. Now, Berlin, even though it is completely within the Soviet zone, it was divided into 4 sectors the same way that the entire country was. Now, since it was in the Soviet zone, Stalin tried to force the Allies out by sealing off the city. The other Allies responded to the blockade with a massive airlift. For more than a year, cargo planes dropped fuel, food, supplies, stuff like that into West Berlin, eventually forcing the Soviets to end the blockade. Now, this only increased tensions, though, eventually leading to opposing alliances being formed. In 1949, NATO was formed, the North Atlantic Treaty Organization, headed by the U.S. and 11 other nations. It was a military alliance where each member pledged to support the others if attacked. In response, in 1955, the Warsaw Pact was established. Headed by the Soviet Union, it included the Eastern European communist countries. It cemented the divide in Europe between democratic West and communist East. Let me take a quick look at the map here. So up here in this one, you've got your 12 founding NATO members. You got the US, Canada, and you see how it's really predominantly Western Europe. You also have some in here from 13 through 19 of countries that joined after 1949. And over here, all right, this is the Warsaw Pact countries, all right, Poland, East Germany, Czechoslovakia, Hungary, and so forth. And this was that divide between East and West. We'll talk more about that in the next chapter. All right, so that wraps things up with the aftermath of World War II. And as I said, still some significant problems that are going to be spilling over into the coming decades. But as I also just said, we'll talk more about that in the next chapter.